Ted is here, and I hope everyone can hear. I First of all, I wanted to make sure that that everyone knew that what the Forbes Funds has been doing is truly remarkable. Um, I work with nonprofits around the United States and nonprofit support organizations around the United States, and these weekly calls where you're bringing people together to convene and discuss stuff is something that many communities aren't doing. And when Fred started rattling off those successes that you've been able to have in such challenging times, I was really put in awe. That's really tremendous work. So I wanted to start out and say, Fred, that's amazing. Olivia, your team, you're just doing so well. I wanted to limit my remarks to about 15 minutes because I'm betting that people on this Zoom session are going to have questions for me. I don't know whether, Olivia, you want people putting those questions in the chat function or you want to use the Q&A function. Either would be fine with me. I'm not going to pay so much attention to that. And Olivia, what I will hope you'll be able to do is sort of monitor those questions as they come in. And at the end of my remarks, then you can sort of feed them to me if that would work. Terrific.
Absolutely, yeah. Hannah and I will be monitoring that.
Fantastic. So here's the roadmap for my remarks today. First of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about the stakes. Then I wanted to provide a common vocabulary for us. And then, as Fred said, I wanted to touch on, in particular, scenario planning, because I'm going to distinguish that from forecasting and talk about how scenario planning can be an extraordinarily powerful tool in very unusual times like these. First, let's talk about the stakes. Well, y'all know from the standards for excellence, which PANO has adopted, that the standards say that organizations are supposed to make every effort to manage risk. And when you look at the business model of the average nonprofit, it's unsurprising why. Not all of these would apply to every one of the organizations on this call, but the fact is the nonprofit business model, even in the easiest times, is a really challenging model. We live hand to mouth. We're supposed to not have a lot of overhead. We have volunteers on our board. Oftentimes, we use volunteers to do mission-critical functions in our organizations. We serve as the backbone of our community very needy service populations. Sometimes those populations are themselves very risky. It is rare that someone is going to get nonprofit services because this is the best day of their life. Sometimes they present risks to themselves and to the people who interact with them at the nonprofit. Of course, nonprofits tend to be understaffed. We talk about the need for redundancy in business. Well, a lot of nonprofits don't even have redundancy in the first place. There are gaps and conflicts and ambiguities that make it really hard for a nonprofit to do its job, even in the best of times. Finally, although this isn't always the case, nonprofits can pay a little bit less than other organizations that do competing services. We think that because people are working for a cause, they don't need to earn as much money. Well, that may be true, but it presents risks for the organization that adopts that sort of talent management approach. That's the best of times. And my view is, if you don't have risk management, you might have a strategic plan, but any strategic plan you have is really just a strategic hope. If you don't know what your real capacities are, then you have no sound basis for projecting out into the future in order to perform at peak capacity going forward. Finally, I always look back to what Warren Buffett says. He's so right. It takes 20 years, 30 years, 40 years to develop a reputation. You can lose it in 5 minutes. One bad step can ruin an organization. So risk management is really important. But let's switch over to that then and talk about the common vocabulary for what risk management really means in practice. Risk management is not a complex thing. Risk management really comes down to just a couple of core concepts. The first concept, and everyone at the Forbes Funds has heard me hear this before, or has heard me say this before, risk is not a bad thing. Risk is simply a fact that we don't have any crystal balls. Actually, if you look over my shoulder here, you'll see I do have a crystal ball, but that thing just doesn't work. We can't rely on something to predict the future. Instead, risk is simply uncertainty, and it's an acknowledgement that we don't know for sure what will happen next. That's a key concept because I advise you to think of negative uncertainties as threats. Threats are things that are unpredictables, that if they happen, could harm the organization. But keep in mind, sound risk management also involves positive risks. What are good things that might happen? Either new initiatives or things that we might change within our organization in order to perform better. Going back to Fred's initial words, he talks about agility in the face of uncertainty. Well, that agility is not just hunkering down like a tortoise. It's also being willing to sprint like a hare. So finally, what's a risk management process? A risk management process is captured by that diagram over on the right-hand side of this screen, which is you first identify risks, then you prioritize them, then you respond to them, then you check and see how you did, then you identify some more, you prioritize some more, you respond some more, and so on and so forth. In other words, if you have a process in place to continually identify risks, prioritize them, respond to them, assess and improve, and do that over and over and over again, well, you have a risk management process. You have a risk management process. So that's the common vocabulary. I want to pivot towards scenario planning by talking about the importance of scenario planning and risk management in the time of COVID. Those are always important concepts, but I've been advising 4 key steps in response to the coronavirus. Those are as follows. First of all, I've been advising people ensure business continuity. Now, everyone on this call has at least stumbled into some form of business continuity, or you wouldn't be on this call. But if you have not formalized your business continuity plan, then one of the things I would advise you to do is at the end of this call, go to Risk Alternatives website, which is called riskalts.com, and search for business continuity and download the free little template that we have. All it is it's a little template that shows the sorts of information you need to gather so that the next time something happens and it's an emergency, your staff doesn't have to reinvent the wheel the way they probably did at the beginning of COVID. So number 1 step, get a business continuity plan. Number 2, make sure that you are not a vector for disease. This is going to be especially challenging over the next couple of weeks because, as Fred said again, we're starting to have to emerge toward a pivot. But what does that pivot look like? And how do we make sure, as responsible parts of our community, that in providing our essential services, we do not harm our staff or present a risk to the beneficiary communities? Here, I have another suggestion. If you reach out to me after this, or I can send it to Olivia or Tamika or Fred, there is a set of guidelines that the CDC put together just recently. They're the guidelines that you probably heard in the newspaper. President Trump rejected because they were a little bit more harsh than he wanted them to be. Well, I'm telling you, if the medical community at the CDC tells you this is how you're going to want to open up, then we as a nonprofit sector should be looking at that framework in order to determine when and how and in what manner we open up. It's not a long document. I think that CDC guidelines, including, a couple of pages for restaurants, a couple of pages for daycare, a couple of pages for organizations that deal with vulnerable populations, altogether, I think it's only something like 17 or 19 pages, but we have to ensure that we are not a vector for disease. Third thing that I talk about with COVID is performing a risk inventory. I'll have a slide on that in a moment, but a risk inventory is designed to make sure that COVID might be your most important thing that you face, but then again, it might not be. You don't want to make the urgent become so focused that you forget about doing other things or perils that you face or opportunities that you face in other areas of your organization. And then finally, we want to make sure that we perform scenario planning. And that will be the last little bit of my remarks. Let me move quickly to a risk inventory. A risk inventory is not something that I'm going to emphasize today because the ForbesFunds is going to give me a chance to emphasize that in later trainings. A risk inventory is a simple name for a simple concept. It's a structured brainstorming of threats and opportunities throughout the organization. You look not only at operations, not only at finances, but also talent management, risk management, compliance, development, IT, all of those various different aspects of your organization. And you do that because you want to prevent yourself from engaging in tunnel vision. You want to make sure that you are not only focusing on COVID and not only on your staff and immediate operations, but also looking opportunistically at threats and opportunities throughout your organization. And then finally, we get to scenario planning. That's what the last 5 minutes of my prepared remarks are going to be. Scenario planning is a critical aspect of an organization, even in the best of times. It becomes absolutely crucial in times like these. Oftentimes, when organizations are facing what they think is a period of normalcy, they will forecast into the future and say, well, that's what's going to happen. So let's do what we need to do now. Forecasting rarely works, even in the best of times. But in times of upheaval, forecasting is the kiss of death. You don't know for sure what's going to happen when you face an unparalleled set of risks. Instead, you should turn to scenario planning. Scenario planning doesn't ask what will happen. Scenario planning hypothesizes a scenario that might happen and then asks crucial questions about it so that you can be more agile in the present. Let me give you a concrete example, and it's one that many of us will be facing. Imagine that it comes November, and we are in November, and your organization faces the following scenario. On the one hand, there's a lot more demand for what you have to offer. You're in the social services sector, or you're in the arts sector, you're in the educational sector, and people are thirsting for these needs to be met. So you have a 15% higher demand for your services. Unfortunately, you also face a year-over-year budgetary shortfall of 20%. So the scenario is 15% greater demand, 20% reduction in available funds. Okay? That's your scenario. So now what you do with any scenario is you ask 3 sets of key questions. Here they are. And the first one, you're going to chuckle a little bit because it sounds like I'm flipping back to forecasting, and I'm not. The first question you and your team ask is, how likely is this scenario? But you're not asking how likely it is so as to predict the future.
Thank you so much for that, Ted. I also want to return to some questions in the chat around, the fact that when we're scenario planning, there can kind of be so many scenarios that you can imagine. How do you make that scenario planning process something that is effective to the largest extent without kind of going into infinite potential scenarios? And so that's one part of the question. And then and maybe a related part as well is no one, I think, was really expecting to have a pandemic necessarily, or to the extent at which it would affect us. So how can we create risk plans or scenario plans that might help prepare us for most situations?
Both are important questions, and I also saw Tamika's question flash by as you were asking that question, Hannah. And Tamika, I'm going to respond to yours as well as Hannah's in this process. Couple of things about that. Scenarios. It is good to use scenarios as concrete as possible. As concrete as possible. So a good scenario to use might be, you know, it is June and Pittsburgh says that we are going to full reopening, but you must abide by the CDC guidelines. The CDC draft guidelines. That's a very concrete scenario because it is time frame based. Let's say June 15th, and so it's June 15th, and Pittsburgh has said we have to abide by the draft CDC guidelines. That's a good scenario. Now let's ask the questions about that and deal with it. To get to Tamika's question about how could organizations across Pittsburgh use this together, that would be an incredibly powerful convening for the Forbes Funds or some other affinity organization, GPNP or someone, to be able to do. Let's pull together the arts organizations and let's do that scenario. Let's have that scenario and let's talk about the difference between, you know, contemporary craft and what they're doing with art stuff and this organization and how would they face that scenario if you know, and could they face it together with greater stability and resilience than they could separately. So Tamika, wonderful notion that this scenario planning is not something that needs to be done only in isolation. It can be done among a group of peer organizations. It can be done in a context like a Forbes Funds convening. It can be done at the staff level. It could be done at the board level of an organization. Lots of different ways that you can get enormous value out of that.
Thank you, Ted, for addressing those. And I want to thank folks as well for putting resources in the chat to share with others on the call. There's a great one from the CDC about, you know, returning to your point about not being a vector for disease, how to keep our facilities clean and safe for folks, as well as other types of risk management materials people can return to. We have a question on, are there models or research about risk assessment specific to?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it was Celeste who asked that question, and not that I'm aware of as specifically to pandemics, although no doubt there are. As I say that now, Celeste, I know that there were some tabletop games in the nasty sense of this, some exercises that were done at senior decision-making levels of the government back in September and October, and some of those may have been shared. I don't know, and I'll try to research that, Celeste. More generally, as to resources, I loved the idea, someone suggested reading Michael Lewis's The Fifth Risk, great book. Another book that people could use if they wanted to think about scenario planning it's called The Art of the Long View. And I can't remember the author. Maybe someone who's close to their Google machine could Google that for me. But it is a great book about scenario planning, and it provides it's a guy who used to work for Shell Oil and was in charge of their scenario planning process, and he gives a very accessible treatment of how to do scenario planning. Peter Schwartz, thank you.
That's great. Yeah, thanks everyone for helping
Yeah, I
out
love
with
the
that.
hive mind.
Absolutely. And I want to ask too about what might success look like in risk planning or scenario planning, and who should perhaps start that kind of conversation in an organization?
Wonderful questions, and I'll start with the latter rather than the former, because I want to dispel a common illusion. The illusion is that risk management should be started at the board level, that you need the board to be behind risk management. My view is to the contrary. Risk management should start at the staff level. Usually it's someone in the C-suite, like, you know, Fred at the Forbes Funds or Olivia at the Forbes Funds, who says, let's nibble at this, let's do a risk inventory and then see how the organization reacts. Occasionally it can be someone more junior who says, hey, we saw this stuff that Bilich over at Risk Alternatives is doing and it looks like something we might want to talk about. But ordinarily, it is the executive director or the chief operating officer or the chief financial officer who will end up beginning to advocate on behalf of a risk management process. So it shouldn't be the board. It should be at the staff level, at least initially, because the staff needs to see, how is our organization going to respond to this? After the staff has some confidence that, yes, this seems to be affecting the system nicely, then you can bring it to the board and ask for the board to give an endorsement through a board resolution and board training about the board's role with risk management. This gets to the other part of the question, Hannah, that you were asking, which is, what would success look like? Well, success in the early stages of risk management would be those moments of eureka, when you do a risk inventory and you find something like the following. Number one, oh my gosh, all of a sudden, I realize that although we've identified 70 risks, and that should scare me, it scares me a lot less because I didn't know how many balls we had up in the air. So there's that eureka moment of clarity that says, oh my goodness, we have a lot going on. A second eureka moment by going through an inventory might be, oh my gosh, I asked 7 members of my staff to do this, and all of them listed 5 of the same areas when they were going or element by element by element. So wow, there's a surprising amount of consistency and awareness within my organization about what our biggest issues might be. Another eureka moment might be, you know, someone like Fred at the Forbes Funds. If you do a risk inventory and something comes up when someone is looking at opportunities as well as threats, and it's this really cool thing that person thought, well, I shouldn't say anything about it because it's outside my swim lane. But because of the risk inventory process, she all of a sudden volunteers it. And Fred's like, eureka, oh my gosh, that's a great idea. And then you have something that you can move forward on. So lots of early wins, even if you never go down the path of a formal risk management cycle, lots of early wins just from the inventory process.
Got it. Those aha moments can definitely be something that really pushes organizations forward. So I'm really glad that you identified those. I'm wondering about, you know, there are different ways in which folks can go about this work, and wondering about, you know, creating committees or kind of groups around risk management. Is that one approach that folks can take, and what are some other approaches as well?
Well, initially what I would do, and I see Eric's question as well about, you know, a risk inventory with smaller staffs and so on. I actually think that when an organization does an initial risk inventory, it should have about 5 people who do it. Fewer if you have a very small organization, but I would suggest you should definitely have your executive director or your chief operating officer, ideally have both of them. You should have the person who is other than that person or persons who is most familiar with your finances, whether that's your outside accountant or if you have a director of accounting or a chief financial officer or something like that, you should have that person involved. If you have someone who is a director of programs, that's a good person to have involved because they're going to be very operationally focused and they're going to be able to bring a lot to the table. But then there's one other aspect, Eric, that might be really important. You should have either a volunteer or a junior staff member, someone who is really boots on the ground at the front line doing the work, who also participates in that risk inventory process. Why is that so important? Well, a friend of mine says there are 4 ways that a process can be defined. The first way is the way that the chief executive officer thinks the process is being operationalized within his organization. The second is the way that the current process is written down within the organization in terms of instructions. The third is how that process is actually being performed by the person who's doing the task. And only the fourth is that wonderful process that could be achieved if you were to take the other 3 and unearth them and bring them together. And so by having someone who is boots on the ground providing the service, you can gain so much more value from that initial risk inventory. So I hope, Eric, that's of some help to answer your question.
Really appreciate that cross-organizational approach to risk assessment, Ted. In terms of outlining risks, folks in the chat are identifying that sometimes there are gaps between the resources you have and the resources you need to address risks that you uncover through this process. So what might it look like to getting support from funders, for example, to address this?
Brilliant question. And Michelle and others who have raised this issue, I think that's very, very important. I can answer that pretty clearly. A couple of years ago, I interviewed 125 senior personnel at major foundations throughout the United States. And these were not little interviews. Sometimes they were an hour and a half long with organizations like the MacArthur Foundation and very large organizations, but also small community foundations. And the answers were overwhelmingly, foundations are very worried about grantee risk management. Furthermore, foundations are worried that nonprofits won't do risk management on their own or start risk management processes because they are so financially strapped and they don't want to spend any money on what people consider overhead. So foundations recognize the dilemma, Michelle, that so many nonprofits are in. There's a way that you can approach a foundation that would say, hey, we want to be on the cutting edge. We see what the standards for excellence say we're supposed to be doing, and we want to be able to abide by those best practices. So we'll go and we'll put $1,000 or $2,000 toward it, foundation, if you would also pony up $3,000 to $5,000 so that we can actually get enough money together that we can go through this process with some expert support and guidance from outside. That is a very, very powerful ask to make for a foundation. And I believe that many foundations would be very receptive. And Michelle in particular, if you reach out to me, we actually have some language that you'd be able to use to talk to a foundation and begin that discussion.